Hi, welcome back. Today we're going to be going over the British North American colonies, the middle colonies in particular today. We're going to examine what these places look like, right? What they produced, what were their economics, right? And then how slavery was also integrated into these colonies. These colonies are going to include New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. Right. While they're distinct from the New England and Southern colonies, I really want you to emphasize that, hey, they're going to take the best parts from above in the Northern colonies and maybe some of the best and worst parts of the Southern colonies, kind of mix them together to try to make like a colony system that's kind of in the middle of both of those. Right. Middle colonies began in our different forms of governance. Right. First of all, we had proprietary colonies, which were granted to individuals by the English crown. These proprietors essentially owned and ran the entire colony, but were ultimately subject to English law and the authority of the king. Then we had royal colonies, which were directly controlled by the king, who appointed the colonial government. This type of colony had less autonomy, with policies closely aligned to the interest of the crown. By 1753, all colonies will have become English royal colonies. The corporate colonies were run by joint stock companies, which are groups of investors who pooled their resources together to fund the colony's establishment and operation. Again, 1753, all colonies are royal colonies, which is going to consolidate the crown's power over the colonial administration. Let's talk about New York. New York will become a British royal colony. New Netherland was originally a Dutch colony primarily focused on trade and commerce. In 1664, English forces arrived and King Charles II granted land to his brother, the Duke of York, even before they had control of the area. Upon taking control, the colony was renamed New York. This transition marked the beginning of New York's development under English rule. The economy of New York relied heavily on trade, but also very large-scale agriculture, similar to the southern colonies. The economic structure made slavery an integral part of the New York colony. Both New York and New Jersey developed economies that were heavily reliant on trade and agriculture. Large-scale farming, especially in New York, necessitated a labor force that included enslaved Africans. Slavery became deeply embedded in the economic fabric of these colonies. Political power in these colonies concentrated in the hands of the aristocratic landowning elite who controlled both the economy and governance, reinforcing a social hierarchy that supported the institution of slavery and maintained power and control in the hands of these elite. Let's move on to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is going to be primarily started and controlled by the Quakers for some time. The Quakers were a religious group known for their radical beliefs, including the equality of all people and opposition to war and military service. They earned their name because they were said to quake during intense religious practices. Their refusal to pay taxes to support the Church of England and their nonconformity to social hierarchies put them at odds with both the religious and secular authorities in England. They also will believe in the equality of men and women, and again are pacifists. William Penn is an aristocratic Englishman and the second son who would not inherit his father's land. He's going to embrace Quakerism after his military service, and in 1681 he will receive a grant from King Charles II to establish a colony in the Americas, leading to the foundation of Pennsylvania. Penn's goal was to create a society based on Quaker principles, including religious freedom and fair treatment of all peoples. The government of Pennsylvania's government was revolutionary for its time. It featured a representative assembly elected by landowners, emphasizing democratic principles. The colony had no tax-supported church, guaranteeing freedom of worship for all. This was a significant departure from the norms of other colonies, where churches often played a central role in governance. Pennsylvania also encouraged unrestricted immigration, welcoming people from diverse backgrounds. Despite these progressive policies, the English government forced the Quakers to deny the right to vote and hold office to both Catholics and Jews. This was a clear example of how even the most progressive colonies had to navigate the restrictive laws imposed by the English crown. They did have a death penalty, and the death penalty in Pennsylvania was limited only to the most severe crimes, such as murder and treason, reflecting the Quakers' emphasis on the sanctity of life. Now, William Penn also sought to establish a just and fair relationship with the Native Americans. Unlike other colonial leaders, Penn purchased the land from Native Americans rather than simply seizing it. Quakers were known for their peaceful interactions with the Native Americans, often going among them unarmed. However, the influx of non Quaker Europeans into Pennsylvania disrupted this harmony. These new settlers treated Native Americans very poorly, undermining the Quakers' effort to maintain peaceful relations. This tension highlighted the challenges of sustaining Quaker ideals in a rapidly growing and diverse colony under increased control of the European crown and new immigrants. Now, Pennsylvania became a beacon for religious misfits and those seeking a life in the Americas. William Penn and the Quakers were adept at advertising the colony across Europe, attracting a wide array of settlers. The colony was marked by its cultural diversity, religious tolerance, with no restrictions on immigration. This open door policy contributed to Pennsylvania's rapid growth and economic success. Notably, Pennsylvania had little to no slavery during this period, setting it apart from other colonies where slavery was a significant institution. Pennsylvania envisioned a society that provided its citizens with economic opportunity, civil liberties, and religious freedom. This vision made Pennsylvania one of the most progressive colonies in British North America. While they did push not to have slavery, slavery again will become an necessary part of any colony in the North Americas. The middle colonies were characterized by larger farms than those in New England, but smaller than the vast plantations of the southern colonies. Emphasis was on subsistence farming rather than cash crops, where farmers were growing enough to sustain their families and communities. These colonies were less aristocratic than the South, with the exception of New York, where land ownership was concentrated in the hands of a few wealthy families. The economy was diverse, encompassing farming, shipbuilding, fishing, and trade. This diversity helped the middle colonies become known as a breadbasket of the colonies, supplying food to other parts of North America and beyond. While there was less slavery than in the South, New York stood out as a major exception with a significant enslaved population. This was due in part to its large-scale agricultural practices and the concentration of wealth and power among the few elite families. The colonies were notable for their emphasis on religious tolerance, cultural diversity, particularly in New York, which was home to settlers from various European countries. Again, there is slavery in the middle colonies. Not as much as the South, but there is slavery in the middle colonies. Speaking of slavery, to understand the role of slavery in the middle colonies, it's important to consider the broader context of mercantilism. This economic policy, popular in the 1700s, was based on the belief that a nation's power was determined by its wealth, particularly its gold reserves and military strength. Colonies existed primarily to serve the economic interest of the mother country. They provided raw materials, which would then turn into finished goods in the home country. The colonies, in return, were guaranteed a market for their products and received military protection from the mother country. Now, in order to keep trade going to England and not other European countries, the Navigation Act of 1650 and 1673 were a series of English laws that restricted colonial trade to English ships and ports. These laws ensured that the colonies could only trade with England, limiting their economic independence, and it's going to really push some colonists to resent the English crown, as now they cannot trade with other European countries and perhaps make more profit. Though the Navigation Acts did provide the colonies with a guaranteed buyer for their goods, they also restricted the colonies' ability to trade with other nations and potentially limiting their profit. The development of African slavery. The first African enslaved peoples were forcibly brought to the North America in 1619. Several factors contributed to the growth of slavery in the colonies. Reduced migration from England meant fewer workers available, creating a demand for labor in the colonies. There was indentured servitude and the enslavement of the Native Americans. Both of these proved to be problematic. Indentured servants often gained their freedom after a few years, and Native Americans either died off from diseases or resisted enslavement, as seen in Bacon's Rebellion. The colonies needed a reliable and cheap labor force to maximize profits, leading to the increased importation of African slaves. Over time, racism and slavery became deeply intertwined, with African peoples being dehumanized to justify their enslavement and to maintain the social hierarchy. As a review, for the Triangle Trade was a three-part trade route which connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas. The trade system played a central role in the development of African slave trade. European ships carried manufactured goods such as textiles and rum to Africa, where they were exchanged for enslaved Africans. The enslaved Africans were then transported across the Atlantic in a journey known as the Middle Passage to the Americas. The conditions on these ships were horrific, and many enslaved people died before reaching the Americas. In the Americas, the enslaved people were forced to work on plantations, producing goods such as sugar and tobacco, which were then shipped back to Europe to complete the trade cycle. The Middle Passage was notorious for its brutality, but it was only the beginning of the suffering that enslaved Africans would face and endure in the Americas. While the South had the largest slave population, slavery existed in every colony, including the Middle Colonies. The institution of slavery was deeply embedded in the economic and social fabric of these colonies, providing the labor force needed to sustain their agricultural economies. In the Middle Colonies, the presence of slavery was most pronounced in New York, where large-scale farming and trade necessitated a large, substantial labor force. The Middle Colonies are unique, right, in their diversity and tolerance, but not an exception from the institution of slavery. Again, they take the parts from the northern colonies, New England colonies, and parts of the southern colonies, and they add it together, and we have this kind of hodgepodge of both. So that's where I'm going to end for today. If you guys have any questions, please ask me or Mr. Chastain for right now, and I'll see you guys in class. Thank you.